My name is Debbie, and at 37 years old, the rain pressed hard against the windows of my condo in Portland. The steady percussion of a storm that felt older than the clouds above the bay. I sat on the couch with my laptop still open beside me, trying to finish a proposal that refused to make sense. My phone buzzed once, sharp in the silence. A new voice memo. I didn't hesitate. I tapped play, expecting to hear a note from a client, or maybe a reminder I had recorded for myself. Instead, Damon's voice filled the room. Mom, I've been thinking about what we talked about. Debbie just isn't reliable. She's unstable, careless. If we want to make sure the house and the accounts are safe, you need to transfer everything to me. I'll handle it. She doesn't have the judgment for this. The words landed like blows, each one tightening the knot in my stomach. 27 seconds. That was all it took to collapse decades of keeping the peace. I sat frozen, staring at the reflection of myself in the dark glass of the window, my face pale and unfamiliar. If you have ever felt betrayed by the people who should have been your biggest supporters, let me know where you are watching from. He hadn't meant for me to hear it. He thought he was whispering in the safe direction of our mother, shaping her view of me one more time. It wasn't just rivalry anymore. It wasn't the usual family scrape of pride and blame. It was a plan, deliberate and sharp, designed to push me out of the story of my own family. The memo ended with the hollow click of silence, leaving me alone with a truth that could never be unheard. I saved the file, set the phone on the table beside me, and leaned back, already knowing that tomorrow I would not wake the same. The storm outside had slowed to a drizzle by morning, but inside my chest, the weight of Damien's voice memo pressed heavier than the clouds. It pulled me backward into years that had quietly prepared me for this moment. Brunswick, Maine. Our childhood unfolded on tree-lined streets where everyone seemed to know my brother's name. Damien was captain of the football team. The boy teachers praised for charm even when his homework was late. I was the one with perfect grades, the girl who sat in the library during lunch. People remembered Damon's touchdowns, not my scholarships. Mom adored us both, but the pride in her voice always swelled louder when she spoke of him. Damien is a leader, she'd say at parent-teacher nights. About me, she'd smile gently and add, Debbie is dependable. It was never meant to sting, but it drew an invisible line between brilliance and background. That pattern followed us into adulthood. When property taxes came due on Mom's old house near Main Street, I was the one on the phone with the assessor's office, sorting out late fees, filing paperwork. Yet at Thanksgiving, Damien would lift his glass and announce, Don't worry, I paid the taxes again this year. Mom's eyes shone, and I stayed silent. He perfected this rhythm. Public praise to keep me compliant, private whispers to cast me as fragile. At family dinners, he'd lean close to Mom and murmur just loud enough for me to hear, Debbie works too much. She forgets things. I worry about her stress. I would chew my food slowly, pretending it didn't matter, pretending the words weren't carving at the edges of my place in the family. Now, with the memo still echoing, I understood those years had been rehearsals. The humiliations I let slide had built the foundation for this latest betrayal. Damien had been writing the family script for decades, and I had played the role he assigned without protest. But sitting in my Portland condo, with proof saved to my phone, I knew the script was changing, and this time I would not deliver his lines. The older I became, the easier it was to confuse Damien's words for truth. They arrived dressed as concern, but underneath they carried the sting of judgment. He would glance at my grocery bags when I stopped by Mom's house and shake his head. Do you really need to spend that much on fresh produce? Debbie, half of it will go bad before you use it. When I reminded him that most of it was for Mom's meals, he sighed as if I were the one wasting money, not caring for her health. At first, I let the comments roll off, but soon they multiplied. He criticized the hours I kept with my consulting clients, hinting that I didn't work enough to contribute. Then in the next breath, suggesting I was too career-driven to be attentive to Mom. When Margot's prescriptions had to be adjusted, he told her I was careless for missing the early warning signs. The bruises he left weren't on my skin, but in the shrinking space I occupied in my own choices, I found myself double-checking every receipt, rereading every medical note, rehearsing explanations before speaking. Then the numbers began to speak louder than his words. One evening, while reviewing Mom's bank statements, I noticed a recurring withdrawal labeled only with an LLC, Damien's LLC. Small at first, $100 here, $200 there, but steady, like a siphon. I traced them back 6 months, nearly $5,000 in total. When I asked him, he laughed softly, like I had confused myself. "Debbie, you misread the statements. Those are reimbursements for expenses I covered. You wouldn't understand. It's complicated." He tilted his head the way he always did, patronizing and polished. And for a moment, I almost believed him, but the pit in my stomach said otherwise. I couldn't bring myself to show Mom, not yet. The thought of shattering her trust in her son felt unbearable. Still, I knew silence made me his accomplice. I folded the statements into a folder and slid it into my desk drawer, the edges cutting into my palm as if to remind me that the truth was sharp and waiting, whether I wanted to hold it or not. Sleep never came after the memo. I lay on the couch until the sky began to gray. The storm outside spent, but the storm inside only beginning. At 5:30, I rose, pulled on a sweater, and moved with the silence of someone trespassing in her own life. The folder with the bank statements was waiting in my desk. I added new pages, copies of utility bills, invoices, anything that tied Mom's finances to Damien's supposed reimbursements. I took photographs of every page, uploading them to an encrypted drive I had set up years ago for work projects. This time, the stakes were far heavier than any client campaign. At Mom's house later that morning, I moved carefully through her study while she was still asleep upstairs. Legal documents lined the cabinet: the deed to the Brunswick property, insurance policies, her modest pension statements. I spread them across the desk, snapped images with my phone, then returned each sheet exactly as I found it. The act felt both protective and invasive, but I reminded myself that neglect would be worse. Back in Portland that afternoon, I combed through my voicemail history, saving every message Damien had left me in the past year, the ones where he sounded charming, offering to take care of things, and the ones where his tone dropped, clipped, and cold. Each file went into a folder labeled simply Proof. The final step was physical. I drove to Brunswick and rented a P.O. box at the post office 2 blocks from the church, where Mom still sang in the choir. From now on, anything important, medical bills, bank correspondence, would come through me first. No more disappearing statements, no more excuses. Standing in the parking lot, key in my hand, I felt the morning air sharpen my lungs. Leaving at dawn hadn't been about escape. It was about mapping the battleground before Damien even realized there was a fight. I drove back toward Portland as the sun climbed above the coast, a pale light spreading over the water, and I knew that what began as 27 seconds of betrayal was already rewriting every hour that would follow. The folder grew thicker by the day, but evidence without direction is just clutter. I needed someone who could turn it into something undeniable. That led me to a brick office near Monument Square in Portland, where an elder law attorney named Thomas Keene agreed to see me on short notice. He listened carefully as I laid out the memo, the withdrawals, the paper trail. When I slid the copies across his desk, his expression hardened. Though his tone stayed measured, he explained fiduciary duty in plain words. Anyone handling a parent's finances must act in the parent's best interest, and any deviation, especially self-enrichment, could qualify as financial exploitation. Guardianship, he added, was only necessary if a court deemed a parent incapable. But in our case, the danger wasn't incapacity. It was trust misplaced in the wrong child. I left with a list of what to gather: clear dates, matching bank statements, records of Damien's signatures, any testimony from people who had seen irregularities. That afternoon, I started making calls. Mom's visiting nurse, who managed her prescriptions, remembered Damien insisting on paying cash for medications that were already covered by insurance. She agreed to write a statement. The church treasurer, a quiet woman named Ruth, told me she had questioned Damien about large donations withdrawn from Mom's account, but he brushed her off. She was willing to document the exchanges. The last step was the bank itself. At Bath Savings, I sat across from a branch manager who had known our family for years. When I mentioned Damien's LLC, his eyebrows lifted. He pulled up account histories, confirmed the auto drafts, and quietly printed records with official stamps. By evening, my dining table was covered with stacks of proof. Each page another brick in a wall Damien could not talk his way around. For years, I had absorbed his words in silence. But now, I held something sturdier than anger. I had receipts, and they would speak for me when my voice alone had never been enough. I gathered the papers into a binder, pressed the cover shut, and knew it was time to carry the truth directly into our mother's hands. I suggested a weekend away, just the two of us, under the pretense that Mom needed a change of scenery. Booth Bay Harbor was quiet in early spring, the boardwalk shops not yet crowded, the sea air sharp with salt. We rented a small cottage overlooking the water, and for the first day, I let her enjoy it. We cooked chowder together, walked along the docks, watched gulls circle above the lobster boats. I waited until the second evening, when the fire had burned low and her hands rested quietly in her lap, before I reached for my phone. "Mom," I said gently, "there's something you need to hear." I pressed play. Damon's voice filled the room, casual and confident. "Debbie just isn't reliable. She's unstable, careless. You need to transfer everything to me. She doesn't have the judgment for this." When it ended, silence settled heavier than the tide outside. Mom blinked, her lips tightening. Finally, she said, "He means well. You know how he exaggerates when he's worried." I slid the binder across the table, page after page, statements, signatures, notes from the nurse, records from the bank. "This isn't exaggeration," I said. "This is what he's been doing." She turned the pages slowly, her shoulders stiff. For every date I named, she searched my eyes, hoping to find uncertainty, but I gave her none. The weight of the documents did what my words alone could never do. Her face softened, but not toward me. It was sorrow, not anger. "He's my son," she whispered, voice trembling. "I can't just cut him off." "I'm not asking you to disown him," I said. "I'm asking you to see the truth." She closed the binder, resting her palm on the cover as though it were fragile glass. After a long pause, she met my eyes. "I need time." It wasn't the victory I wanted, but it was a breach in the wall Damien had built. For the first time, Mom had heard his words without his smile to disguise them, and the silence that followed felt like the beginning of a reckoning. I let the fire burn lower, still knowing the next move would not be mine alone. The invitation came through Mom, not Damien, which told me enough. He had arranged a brunch in Portland, choosing a waterfront restaurant where half the family could gather under the pretense of celebration. When I arrived, Damien was already seated beside Mom, his arm draped casually along the back of her chair, his smile broad enough to convince anyone he had nothing to hide. The first half hour was theater. He ordered for her, joked about my late nights and deadlines, then turned his voice serious. "I worry about Debbie," he said, glancing at Mom, but projecting to the table. "She's been overworked, a little paranoid lately. She thinks there are problems with Mom's accounts, but it's just stress." Mom didn't contradict him. She sat with her coffee, nodding faintly, her eyes lowered. For a moment, I felt the floor tilt beneath me. His words were smooth enough to erase the weekend in Booth Bay, smooth enough to make me doubt whether the binder and the memo still mattered. But I had come prepared. I opened my bag and slid out notarized letters from Bath Savings, each stamped with official seals. Next, I produced a sheet of recorded timestamps showing Damon's withdrawals, matched against dates when he told Mom he was paying expenses on her behalf. I laid them on the table in silence. Our cousins leaned in, Aunt Carol adjusting her glasses to read. Mom looked stricken, torn between us. Damon's voice rose, sharp, cracking the veneer. "This is manipulation. Debbie has always been jealous. She doesn't understand real responsibility." His hand hit the table, rattling the cutlery. No one rushed to soothe him. They simply stared, the polished mask slipping in front of the very witnesses he had invited. I gathered the letters back into my bag, my heartbeat steady. For the first time, the room wasn't bending around his version of the story. It was bending around the truth, and the weight of silence no longer belonged to me. The fallout from that brunch rippled faster than I expected. Within a week, Bath Savings froze the transfers tied to Damien's LLC, citing irregular activity pending review. The numbers that once slipped quietly out of Mom's account now sat under a microscope, every withdrawal a bright red flag. Thomas, the attorney, moved quickly. He filed for emergency accounting, requesting a court order that would force Damien to produce records of how he had managed Mom's funds. "It's the first step," Thomas told me, "but it's enough to make him sweat." Meanwhile, the church treasurer reached out. Ruth said the board had decided to suspend Damien's proposed charity fund until they could verify where the contributions originated. It was a careful choice of words, but I heard the truth underneath. They no longer trusted him. Damien didn't go silent. He called late at night, always after midnight, his voice low and tight with fury. "You don't know what you've started, Debbie. You think you're helping her? You're ruining everything." I let him talk, let the venom spill through the line, and kept my phone recording on the table beside me. Each threat, each slip of temper became another file labeled proof. I didn't respond to his accusations. Silence was stronger than any argument, and it rattled him more than my words ever could. By the third call, his tone shifted from anger to pleading, but I kept recording, and I kept my distance. Mom sensed the shift too, though she didn't speak of it openly. She lingered longer on the phone with me, asked careful questions, wanted reassurance. The doubt that had held her quiet at brunch was beginning to crack, replaced by something heavier, recognition. I stored the latest recordings alongside the bank letters, the binder growing heavier with each passing day, and I knew the weight would soon be too much for Damien to carry. The decision came quietly, without ceremony. Mom sat across from me in the conference room of a Brunswick law firm, her hands folded in her lap as the trustee read through the terms. Every asset, her home, her accounts, the modest pension she had guarded since my father's death, was placed into a living trust overseen by 2 independent attorneys. Damien's name disappeared from the paperwork like it had never been there. From that moment forward, nothing could move without dual oversight. When the pen left her hand, Mom exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for years. She looked older and lighter all at once. Later that afternoon, back at the house, she took me into her study. Without speaking, she opened the desk drawer and pulled out a brass key on a small ring. She pressed it into my palm. "It's for the cabinet," she said softly. "Everything important is inside. I want you to have it." The weight of that key cut deeper than any signature. It wasn't just access. It was trust, finally given without condition. Damien arrived soon after, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frames on the wall. When Mom told him about the trust, his face flushed red, his voice rising in a torrent of accusations. He turned to our aunts and cousins for support, but no one moved. Their silence was different this time. It wasn't fear, it was refusal. He stormed out, the sound of the door echoing down the hall. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small in his wake. I stood in Mom's study, the key warm in my hand, knowing the ground had shifted for good. What remained now was not just protection, but the map forward, the life I would have to choose for myself. Months later, the rhythm of my life no longer carried the weight of constant defense. I signed the lease on a modest apartment near Casco Bay, its windows opening to the harbor where the tide rose and fell without anyone's permission. It was mine, paid for with my own earnings, untouched by Damien's reach or Mom's accounts. For the first time, the walls around me belonged solely to me. I kept the brass key on a hook by the door, not because I needed it for access, but because it reminded me of the moment when trust shifted into my hands. Mom still lived in the old house, her care now overseen with clear boundaries. Our conversations had softened. We spoke less about Damien and more about recipes, the garden, and the choir she returned to. She no longer asked me to carry her worries in silence. Out of the struggle, something unexpected grew. With help from the church treasurer and legal aid, I started a small community fund for caregivers, designed to cover transportation, prescription gaps, and respite hours for those tending to aging parents. Donations were modest, but each one carried the promise that others would not feel as cornered as I once had. Sometimes, when I walk along the bay in the early morning, I think back to that first dawn when I copied documents in the dark. I know now it was not an escape, but a line drawn on a map. Each step since has been a point connected to the next, forming a route no one else could claim. I didn't leave to run away. I left to write the plan in ink so it could never again be erased.